Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest back on the podcast, Jordan Lips. Yeah, I'm thinking this has probably got to be sixth, seventh time, if not maybe a little bit more. But either way, recurring guest, love chatting with you, man. I know since the last time we chatted, you had a few big life events pop up. So congrats on the child that is going to be here. And you said, what, 3 months? So you have that and you finished your half marathon. So I'm sure we'll chat on both of those things at some point throughout.
Yeah, man. Thanks, dude. Appreciate having me. We always have good chats. I get just like having people in my life that I just like, and your podcast, us having chats is always another one of those for me of like just cyclically updating, having people in your life that you know are equally plugged into some of the stuff that you're interested in. And like every like X amount of months being like, oh, what have you been up to lately? What have you found? What are you excited about? Those sorts of conversations are always fun.
Yeah, it's almost like hanging out, but just asking you questions and
Yeah,
recording it and,
exactly.
and letting everybody else
Yeah.
see it.
In on our
Um,
chat. Yeah.
yep. Cool. Yeah, I guess to start it off, man, the half marathon, I know you were working super hard for that. So just curious how that went. And I'm sure we can, if any questions pop up, I'll ask about that.
Yeah. It went well, which is like, what does that mean? I think whenever you say something went well, what you're saying is that it went well based on what you think that means. And for me, what that means is I did what I came to do, and we had a plan, and that plan was executed, and it was a good learning experience. And it was like people ask me like, was it fun? Oh, was it fun? And I'm like, that's such an interesting question because the no, I don't actually. I'm not like out there on doing cardio. I don't like doing the workouts like I do lifting. But for me, the whole experience of starting with the training and learning about the programming and learning about why we're doing stuff and watching myself get a little bit better and understanding how to take the training and then put it into a strategy and then how to optimally fuel yourself for that and then applying that strategy and some of the race dynamics, like all of that I find like stimulating and fun.
Yeah.
The actual race like was not awful, but it was, yeah, that's not fun, isn't the word I'd use to describe that, but the whole experience of going through the training and the learning and the execution, super duper fun. So I will start funny and I'll just like, I don't care about what I'm about to say, which is why I can say it like with a little tongue in cheek. I suck at this. And I don't, it's not like I suck at it compared. Yeah. What I mean by that is, I don't know. I'm not blessed. Like genetically, when it comes to cardio, I have friends that like roll out of bed hungover and go run like half marathons or don't really take care of themselves health and fitness wise, but can somehow be just fine at a 5K or just fine at a half marathon. Or my friends who have barely trained, just like play soccer. I have friends on my soccer team that like play like kind of BS soccer a couple times a week and then run full on marathons. And I'm just not that genetically predisposed to it. And so whatever, I don't care about that. Actually, if we're just going to stay on that for 1 second, I do care about that. And this is like something that's just come to my mind is, you know what a lot of your clients say they want is they want to look like they lift. Right. They're like, I'm not asking for much. I'm not asking to be a bodybuilder, but I'd like to look like I do the thing that I do. That's not too much to ask. And what that means to each person is a rabbit hole for sure. But that is on balance what most people want when they start lifting. They're like, I'm lifting, so I look like I lift. And I want to do cardio so that you just to get good enough that you know that I do this. Now, you can't say I look like I do cardio because I don't. Truthfully, I think cardio has no impact on the way you look. Trying to say that it burns calories, it helps you lose weight, it's not really a connection I like to make. But funny, what do I want to do? And I know you didn't ask this, but I want to do cardio to get, so funny. I want to get good enough so that people who just fucking roll out of bed, they're not better than me. And I know that's like a little egotistical or whatever, but that fires me up a little bit. I had dinner with a friend of mine who was like I will talk about what's next for me. And he was like telling me that he was traveling a little bit, was staying with some friends, and that family was like running a 5K the next day. And they had gone out the night before and barely slept and drank all night and then rolled out of bed and ran a 5K. And he mentioned his time. And it's like the time I'm shooting for. And I'm like, fuck that, man. I texted my coach and I was like, I'm fired up because I can't have people rolling out of bed hungover just as good as me. And I'm training for this. And again, a little egotistical, but just like in more of a fun way, in more of a, it fired me up. So I'm like, I want to get good enough, just good enough. I don't have big ambitions, but I want to get just good enough that I look like I lift. I train for this thing. So whatever. I ran my half marathon in 2 hours and 19 minutes. My goal was 2 hours and 20 minutes. And so it was like on the dot, what we had thought I was capable of and what I could do. The taper really worked. Overall, it was really fun to develop a strategy. And yeah, it was a good experience overall. And what I'm going to be, one of my, like, not New Year's resolutions, but something I'll be doing in the new year is taking on clients who not necessarily want to train for races, although I think that can be fun, but who want to do some hybrid training, who want, even that word, just like a little cringe, but who want to incorporate cardio with as much detail as we all have normalized going at your weight training with, and who want to be doing both at the same time.
Yeah, and you've gone through it, so you obviously know how to manage both at this point. And yeah, I think that's cool. And it's awesome to want to have both those goals because they are a little bit different. I know we've talked about this last couple of times we've had you on. I feel like the cardio is a little bit different than the weight training and stuff like that. As far as your timing goes, you said you got it under 219. Is that like, where did you guys come up with that 220 number out there on that?
Yeah. So throughout the training, you're trying to get a gauge for how fit I am, let's say, and what I could do. And so you're using some of your training as like race test practice. And I'll start by saying, I'm going to be like annoyingly black and white about this. It's not this black and white, but just to make a point, if you can't run the race that you have in front of you, half marathon, 5K, 10K, marathon, whatever, if you can't run it straight without walking under a 10-minute mile pace, then you should strongly consider doing a run walk strategy. And the reason is that if you're running at like an 11-minute mile pace, which is 4.5-ish on the treadmill, right? I'm not crazy. 11-minute miles faster than that. It's faster than 5. I lied. It's 5.2 or something like that, 5.5. Let me just double check that, because mile per hour to mins per mile, just so I don't talk out of my ass here. What is that? Mile per hour, mile per hour. Yeah, 5.5 is 10.9. So whatever, like 5.4 on the treadmill. Just because people can, not everyone speaks minutes per mile. Some people speak treadmill language. That, if you were to like videotape yourself and do a gait analysis of what that looks like, it's a very inefficient running technique. And what inefficient just means is that you're expending more energy per distance traveled. It's a technique that is like shuffling. You're like shuffling. And so you're doing this kind of like half run, half jog, half walk. It's just per unit of distance traveled, you're expending relatively more energy. And so I could have run the whole race at an 11, right? I could have run the entire thing without stopping at an 11, but that would have been, the goal is to finish as fast as possible. So what I'm trying to say is, if instead of running the whole thing straight without stopping at an inefficient pace, why not run at a more efficient pace in an interval fashion? Because both walking and running at a more efficient pace are both more efficient than this weird kind of shuffle that you'd have to do at this like 11, 12-minute mile pace. And so that was something that we realized very quickly. It was like, I'm not fit enough to run this whole thing without stopping at an efficient technique. If I try and run this whole thing without stopping, I'm going to do a weird, inefficient shuffle. So instead of doing that, we were like, okay, your running technique, it's way more efficient in the 9 to 9:45 mile pace, more in that 6 to 6.5 miles per hour pace. Your technique, it's way more efficient. It's way more fluid. It's way more intuitive. It's way more natural for me as an individual than if I run at 11-minute mile pace, let's say. And if I can do that for a certain amount of minutes at a time, and then walk, and then do that for another 4 to 10 minutes at a time, and then walk, I'll actually be able to finish this thing faster. And that's not individual to me. It makes so much damn sense to me. And I know that this is not a highly controlled experiment, but there were loads of people in the race that started off faster than me and did not have a strategy, that looked like they were just going out there running it, which most people do, which is fucking fine, man. It's awesome. I'm not trying to look down on that. Like, you have to have some super specific plan all the time. All I'm saying is there were people in the race that started off faster than me and ended up petering out towards the end. And I couldn't help. And I'm not saying I went and passed 50 people and all those people, but there were certainly people that started off faster than me, at least 20 people that throughout the race, I was like, yep, you should have run walk this. Yep, you should have run walk this. You should have had an interval strategy here, because you went out at a pace that you just couldn't keep up. And now you're dying in the second half of the race. So your question was, how do you figure that out? A little bit of guess and check. We don't need to go too deep into this, but one of the goals of trying to put together a really good program for somebody is trying to figure out what their lactate threshold is. We don't need to necessarily worry about that. When you hear somebody say lactate threshold, it's usually a pace that they can keep for 30 to 60 minutes straight. It's a pace that they can sustain, just not forever. It's not a pace that if you're like, wow, 5 minutes of doing this and I'm cooked, I'm done. It's a pace they can sustain, just not forever. And so if you can identify where just shy of that is, you can really have somebody run for a very long time. And so trying to figure out what sub threshold, close to threshold, maybe 90 to 97% of what your threshold pace is, you can do a lot of work there. And the correlation is something like 2 to 3 RIR. You can do a lot more volume there, right?
Yeah.
If we do a lot of sets at 2 RIR, if you're like, hey, I'm only going to do sets at 2 RIR, you can do a lot more work there than if you took all your sets to failure. And so you're identifying, it's not the exact perfect analogy, but you're identifying where is that, what's a 10 RM with the 2 to 3 RIR? What does that look like? Because I can string together a lot of sets. And because a half marathon is a long distance, that's obviously valuable for you to be able to do this for a long time. So a lot of trial and error brought me to, roughly a 9:30 pace for like roughly 7 minutes. And if I rest for a minute and a half, meaning if I walk, I could probably do that infinitely. I could probably, by the time that minute and a half is over, I'm not 100% recovered by any means. And when you're doing a race, the goal isn't to pick an infinite pace. The goal is to take one step over the finish line and die. And so it was certainly pushing my boundaries within the half marathon, but it felt roughly, if you gave me 8 of those intervals or 18 like I had to do in the race, I could probably do both. I'd survive both. So you're trying to figure out where is that pace that you can do maybe roughly for 6 to 12 minutes at a time and rest maybe 1 to 2 minutes and really string together a lot of those rounds. And so, listen, the goal is obviously to run this at an efficient, fast pace the whole time, but not everyone's fit enough for that, myself for sure included. And so if your only option, if you are trying to run a race straight, but you're doing it at a weird shuffle pace because you think, listen, I went into this race with the one goal. Only goal was to finish this without walking. But that was backwards way of thinking because my ego was tied to that as a psychological thing of I want to mentally conquer that challenge of not walking. But like it turns out like immediately the logic is, that's logically flawed. You will do worse if you do that. If I could run the whole thing at a 9-minute mile pace, I would. That would be great. But in order to run the whole thing without stopping, it would have to be an inefficient technique. And so it made a lot of sense to me. It's like, why am I having this energy leak with this weird shuffle thing? Why not pick a pace that's way more intuitive and then just run the thing?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I've never even thought of it that way. Like you said, it just usually is, oh, hey, just run the whole thing and just try to get you the best time as possible. But that makes sense if you're shuffling, like like you said, you're expending more energy and then like you're sitting there running a pretty quick pace and then you slow down a little bit, but you never, as a whole, you're able to go a little bit quicker because of that. And so you mentioned that like that miles per hour and 11-minute mile pace. Is that across the board or was that specific to you there on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say that there's certainly a range if you look at people across populations, but it depends on your individual biomechanics. Okay. But that said, it's not like the difference between individuals is so wide. There's nobody running an 11-minute mile pace and it's a super efficient pace. It's a little bit of no man's land. When we look at like 4.5 on a treadmill is this, again, it's not this black and white. We're just painting a picture here. But if you get on treadmill and you do 4.5, you will be torn between a really slow jog and a really fast walk. And it's almost like that is the perfect moment of, oh yeah, this is not an efficient technique because it's an inefficient walk because I'm fucking sprint walking or I'm super hyper slow jogging. It's not great for either of those things. And 4.5 miles per hour is probably like a 12-minute mile pace. Yeah, 13.3. And so, we see that there's batches though. There seems to be people that have multiple speeds that they can have an efficient technique at. And that's cool and all, but in order to be in that class where you have an efficient technique at a 6 to 7 mile per hour pace or 6 to 7 minute mile pace and a 9 to 9:30 pace, you have to be pretty darn fit. Like my most efficient pace is still probably faster than this, but I'm nowhere near fit enough to run at an 8-minute mile pace for any length of time. So it's just not practical. The goal would be, let's say my most efficient technique is in that 7 to 8:30. If you literally look at energy expenditure to distance traveled, that's going to be most efficient. The problem is I'm just not fit enough to do that for any practical length of time. And so the goal is, of course, to get there. And so what's the fastest I could run for 6 to 12 minutes at clip, survive it, rest a little, string together a lot of those intervals, and overall create an environment that's more efficient. Walking at 3 miles an hour is a very efficient technique for that pace. And jogging at 9 to 10 is not the most efficient, but much more efficient. And so combining two paces that were efficient led to a faster pace. I finished in roughly a 10-30 minute mile split, and I probably could have run it in like an 11-minute mile split. And so you could say shaved off quite a bit of time by run walking it.
Because I'm sure too, if you just ran like 1 mile to see what it was, you'd be able to get that in a pretty good amount of time. But then obviously the issue comes in when you have to do that for multiple miles on end. And so then that kind of like low or increases that number there over time with it.
Yep. That's it.
Cool. And then you mentioned too that kind of like lactate threshold. I know you said don't focus on that too much. Is that kind of range there? Like I don't know if how much you use like heart rate zones during this. Is that kind of like your prototypical like zone 2, zone 3, or is that not the best way to look at that?
Yeah, it can be. It depends how much we want to really anchor on these biomarkers. And if you're like going to use lactate threshold without actually testing your lactate, then it's mostly a proxy for a 30 to 60 minute effort. It's tough to put in heart rate zones of exactly where, listen, technical zones, it's going to be the upper end of zone 3 on a 5-zone system is going to be your second lactate threshold. There's technically 2, your VT2, your LT2 is going to be that point. And you want to stay just under that. Again, for long distance running, if you can stay just under that, staying just under that, like we talked about, is a really good SFR. And that's funny is like, maybe we've even talked about some podcasts, but the term or the acronym SFR hasn't made its way into endurance exercise, but they've been, and so it's not like Dr. Mike coined the term SFR. It's not like nobody understood the concept. He just brought it into a very concise acronym and it clicked for a lot of people. But all athletes and endurance athletes and strength training athletes and have been understanding the concept of SFR for a long time. And endurance athletes have been understanding this for a long time. For them, lactate threshold is a physiological point where if I go a little faster than that, I definitely get more adaptations, right? I get more stimulus, but I get an exponential greater increase in fatigue. And so staying right under that is where it's believed to have a really good stimulus, a lot of high intensity stimulus. I mean, upper end, right in that zone 3, upper end is where there's a ton of stimulus. The way you could describe it is if you run at like 98% of your lactate threshold or 102% of your lactate threshold, the stimulus are arguably indistinguishable. But if you go over, the fatigue cost is higher. Now, it's not so black and white. I'm going to say that a million times.
Yeah.
But the concept of SFR is not lost on you. It's not lost on anyone where it's like, hey, like if I know after many months of training that my lactate threshold, my roughly 30 to 60 minute max effort pace is around that 9 minutes. It's around 9 minutes, 9-minute mile pace. And I know if I go out and I run 8:30, you might be like, that's only a little faster than 9. Maybe that's your 30-minute max. Maybe it's your 25-minute max. It's not. I fatigue much quicker, exponentially quicker. Not exponentially like in 3 minutes, but I might do that for 6 minutes and be like, oh, I'm fucking dead. I'm done. I need to stop. And that's only a 30-second per mile pace that's quicker. And so I'm not saying it's on a knife's edge, but if you do enough training, if you are doing this sort of thing where you're taking it a bit more seriously and you're using paces and you're being very detailed, which you don't have to, which is a big thing that we can talk about today. You don't have to be this neurotic about it, but you'll find out that that there is something to this. If I stay at this pace, it's hard, but I can keep going. But if I go even just a little bit faster, I feel like my time to fatigue goes down sharply, where I'm like, oh, I need to end this pretty quick. But even just a little bit slower than that feels hard, but not infinitely sustainable. But you don't get that fear factor that creeps in of, oh man, I'm almost toast here. It's almost, oh, this is hard, but I can keep going. And it is, interestingly, it's not on a knife's edge, but it is a tighter window than you'd expect.
Yeah, you would think that it just slowly, each time you get a little bit higher, it's the same, but there is that kind of like slope where it just freaking falls off.
You'd expect it to be more linear, where it's like, if I run a little faster, I can do it a little shorter. If I run a little faster, I can do it a little shorter, but it's not linear. It's exponential in some way, which has been cool to see. And I've kicked my own ass going out too fast on certain intervals because I felt good that day or it's nice out or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I know my program says 9, but I'm running at an 8:25 and all of a sudden I'm smoked. And again, it's not black and white and it doesn't happen to everyone. And some people have a lot of wiggle room and some people think their threshold's 9 and it's really 8:25. And so they end up not having a big difference, but that's mostly because that they are underestimating what they're capable of and all that stuff.
It sounds like there has to be a little trial and error too with some of it as well, and trying to figure it out at least initially. And I guess once you kind of get that baseline, it probably makes things a little bit easier though. But initially, there's going to be that kind of trial and error with it to figure out what that is.
Totally. But it's totally some trial and error, but you can expedite that process if you really want to. You can do a lactate threshold test. You can do if you can sustain this level of output or pace for about 12 minutes, if you die on roughly the 12-minute mark, the irony is that's probably around your threshold. I know I said 30 to 60 minutes, but there is something to be said about, yeah, I didn't what I'm about to say doesn't sound like it makes sense, but it makes sense when you start doing endurance exercise. Is if it sucks for 10 minutes, like your lactate threshold is going, if you run at that pace, it's going to suck 4 minutes in, 3 minutes in, and it's going to feel like you want to stop, but you don't have to. And so when I say that if you can do it for 12 minutes, you can probably do it for 30, that makes no sense. But it's true. It's true. And it only was true to me when I started doing like these like 6-minute intervals. And I was like, Alex, like I'm dying. These are really tough. And he's okay, go for 7, or okay, go for 8, or okay, go for 9. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that like I could withstand as much suck as I thought. And that just because that suck was increasing over the course of 6 minutes, that wasn't predictive of that suck continuing to increase. It's almost like that suck was increasing. And as it is feeling more difficult, there's a fear factor that kicks in. You're like, oh, I'm getting more tired. You're guessing because you're getting more tired that you'll continue to get more tired. But that feeling somewhat levels off. And so there is a straight up lactate threshold test, which involves some short, fast intervals and then a 30-minute max test. You take the back 20 minutes of that, you take the average pace, and you use that as a ballpark. There is also, I like to work my clients up to a 3 by 8 minute interval with a minute or two in between. And if you can accomplish a 3 by 8 minute interval, which is 24 net minutes running at this pace, that's a decent marker of, hey, this is a really good sub threshold pace where we can get a lot of good work. We can get nerdy, we can talk lactate threshold, we can do all this stuff, but I hope afterwards we can talk about how to simplify it. But if you look at some of the best runners in the world, they acknowledge that sub threshold is where they're going to do the vast majority of their hard training because they can do a lot of it. And so if you look at like the Norwegian method or whatever, where some of the best runners come from, they do a ton of zone 2 work, a ton of low intensity work, like 80% or more. And then of what's left, most of that is sub-threshold work because they know that's probably the fastest they can run with a really good SFR. And they probably do about maybe one workout north of where you start to see some SFR drop off, really high intensity. Maybe it's hills or something like that, because there are some adaptations there that are a little bit more specific to that. And so coming from a lifting background, the SFR stuff it just clicks so much. It's like I could do 3 by 8 at a 9-minute pace. But if we go to an 8:30 pace, I could do 3 by 3 minutes. And the net stimulus from the SFR of those workouts is hugely different. 3 by 8 sub threshold. Yeah, it's a little bit less stimulus, but I just did 24 minutes. So the total stimulus is probably better. And maybe I can do 2 or 3 of those each week. Where if I go out and I do my 3 by 3 minutes, but I really crush it, maybe that smokes me and I can't do as much. Again, it's not so black and white, but it does seem like that 4 to 12 minute intervals represents a pace that's like loosely sub-threshold, that loosely represents a good SFR so that you can do more of it.
Gotcha. Yeah, because that higher intensity stuff, that's going to be the more fatiguing. And like you said, you're not going to be able to do as much there with that. And you said that's usually that sub like 4 minute or
yeah, anywhere from like 15 seconds to 4 minutes is pretty darn high intensity. What's interesting is if you're not that fit, like you have to start somewhere. Like I started off with 2-minute runs. Like I just didn't know what I was capable of. Even 2 minutes of running, I was gassed. So I don't want everyone to hear this and be like, oh, you can't do sub 4 minutes. There's a merit to every intensity times duration relationship. Sprints all the way to walking, zone 1 to zone 5. There's merit to all of it. And to come back to earth for just a second, go on a soapbox just about this, the less you do, the less it matters what you do. And so like I certainly have clients who are like super like me, where they're just getting excited about the precision and learning about whatever lactate threshold, whatever, heart rate zones, whatever. But you go out a little too hard. If you're doing a couple days of cardio, it's not going to kill you. You're going to be fine. The reason that the less you do, the less SFR matters. And we've had a million chats on this podcast about more of a minimalist style approach. the more minimalist you go with your lifting, the less SFR you care about, the more S you care about. The more stimulus to STR you care about, more stimulus to time ratio. So the less you're doing, the more you care about getting a lot of stimulus, because you're not really pushing the bounds of what you can recover from. So you might as well get as much stimulus as you can. And I'm taking on clients, and we are certainly playing an SFR game, but are like, for a professional runner, if they are going out trying to do one of their lactate threshold workouts and they go a bit too hard, they're like running right up, they're flying so close to the sun in terms of fatigue that could really screw them up. But like you, me, the average person, if I was supposed to go, my heart rate is supposed to be like 165 and it's 174 and whatever, that's not perfect. But if I was supposed to go sub threshold and it was too hard, that's happened to me before plenty of times in the exploration process. And I'm like, yeah, like this weekend, I went on a trail run. I took one of my workouts and we were talking about, hey, what's a trail run like? And I just want to learn more about what the utility of that is. And it smoked me, absolutely smoked me. This workout was supposed to be maybe RPE 7 or 8. I was cooked. But like for me, yeah, it's not the end of the world. It was a learning experience. I'm not flying so close to the sun that one workout that's too hard is going to kill me. And I love the nerdy stuff about this. I know you do too. And I know that we do the same thing, you and I, with lifting, where I read every paper. I listen to everybody's point of view. I'm fucking diving in. We're going to N1. We're doing seminars. And then we come back. To, you got to do a lot of hard sets over time and not get injured.
Yeah.
You know? And so it's both of those things for sure.
Has it changed how, going through this process, has it changed how you program? Like, I'm just thinking more for somebody who's just they're just trying to improve their cardiovascular fitness. Has it changed how you program for that or anything like that? What would that typically look like for,
Definitely.
your gym pop?
No, definitely. I think even if you're not training for a race, I think the two low-hanging fruits are somewhere 4 to 12-minute intervals. And I will normally split it up into 3 domains: sprinting, lactate threshold intervals, and then low intensity zone 2 work. And if I have somebody who can train 3 days a week, we might start off with one of each of those. And then depending on if they want to train for a race or something, we might the sprints might be the first thing to go. The like 15-second all-out effort isn't even cardio. It's not. It's a zone 5. Technically, the definition of zone 5 is failure by muscular failure, essentially. Neuromuscular failure, not cardiovascular failure. Usain Bolt is not at all fatiguing because his cardio is fatiguing. It's all neuromuscular. And so if somebody's, I want to run an 800 meter, we might have more of that sprint work in. But if you're like 5K, 10K, even a 5K, like sprints are just non-specific enough. But I might have them in the beginning because I might want them to get some of those neuromuscular adaptations that are only available. And sprinting I don't necessarily mean sprinting on your feet. It could be sprinting on an air bike. It could be sprinting on a bike or rower. I just mean all out efforts.
So you're saying for Gen Pop, it's like, hey, you're probably going to hit all 3 and that interval work's going to be like 4 to 12 minutes. Again, I'm sure the volume on that is just going to depend on like the timing of it or like how long do those workouts you
Yeah, I think it depends, obviously, of course, on how fit you are and goals and stuff. But I would probably start somebody with 3 intervals of, I have a workout that I'll give people right when they sign up. And it's a workout that I want to help me assess where they're at. And that interval that workout is 3 intervals of 4 minutes on, 2 minutes walking. And so 3 by 4 with a 2-minute rest in between. And that 4 minutes, the only description I give you is run at a nice intuitive pace that you think you can do for this whole workout. And that's where I would have people start if they're like wanting to start to design some intervals for themselves, is go out and run for 4 minutes straight at a pace that you feel is comfortable. Walk for 2 minutes, which is like the analogous to give yourself a full rest and recover, almost not to baseline, certainly not still huffing and puffing from the prior interval. Do that 3 times and see how it went. And you can get more neurotic from there and what your pace was. And if we saw some accumulating fatigue from heart rate going up each time, but I'll usually give people anywhere. What we're trying to do is probably work up to something like anywhere from like 20 to 30 minutes of work. And so that 3 by 8 is a 24-minute of workout. So anywhere in that like 20 to 30 minutes of time spent running, but you really have to work up to that. And I started with 5 by 2 minutes of running, you know what I mean? So doesn't need to be anything specific, but you are looking for something like 20 to, again, it's not black and white, but somewhere in that 15 to 30 minutes of working minutes for sure.
And I'm assuming you can carry this over to like biking or any other form of cardio. Like it doesn't have to necessarily just be running there that you're talking
Totally.
about. Yeah. And then if you could only do one or two, right? Somebody can only commit to 1 or 2 days for cardio and the rest of the time they want to spend lifting weights and stuff like that. Which ones are, I'm assuming you're getting rid of the sprinting, the really high intensity, slower, or what do you, yeah, what does that look like?
But yeah, if you're like on the chopping block and stuff, I have 1 day, what should I do? If I have 2 days, what should I do? And I think you have to come back to the less you do, the less it matters. And I don't mean to, I'm not saying the less you do, the less you give a shit about all this, but I just mean like you don't have to worry so much that there's a much better and worse option. So if you're like doing 2 days a week, what's funny is like technically speaking, the less you do, the harder you can go. Like we said, the more minimalist lifting, the less sets you're doing, the harder each set should be. So if I have a Gen Pop person I want to add 2 days of cardio and I do 3 days of lifting, it's like that person's not, unless they're like in a deficit and going through a divorce and they never sleep, they're probably not flying close to the sun in terms of overall like stress. I still think it's good to incorporate some low intensity exercise. I think establishing what zone 2 feels is an important skill for when just to acknowledge what that feels like. I think is a really important like first step of, hey, what does low intensity but hard enough to get an adaptation feel like? Even if you're like, hey, I'm only doing 2 days, which means I could probably do higher intensity work both days and recover from it. And wouldn't that be more stimulus? It would be. But I probably would keep a low intensity one day of low intensity in there. That yes, there maybe are some adaptations that you get better in that low intensity state, but I also just think it's because it doesn't matter so much. I value you gaining the skill of what that feels like during this process.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So at least trying to keep one of those in there at least once a week if you can for the low intensity stuff. Cool. I was just curious. I know we had chatted about this, but just real quick, like what were some things, what did your, like, again, I think you were weight training 3 times a week, right? Hypertrophy. And I think you were just sitting everything, again, just trying to do as much as you could there and just maintain as much as you can. From the cardio side, what did that look like? I'm just curious to hear how you train for that again.
Totally. I had 3 days full body lifting, and then I had 2 days of running, which were based around these sub-threshold intervals. And then I had 1 day of zone 2 on the bike, 1 day of intervals on the bike, and 1 day of plyometrics. Now I'll level with you. This was a lot. This was a lot of time allocation for me. If you're an endurance junkie, this is not a lot. But if you're like a regular person, this is a lot. I'm admitting this was a lot. This is an unsustainable lifetime amount for me for sure. And so it was 2 runs, 2 bikes, and a plyometric. So 5 sessions, 3 lifts, 8 sessions a week, 2 days of 2 days to make sure I have a day or two of nothing. And yeah, those 2 threshold intervals, one of them was a little easier, one of them was a little harder. I'd have one kind of hardest workout on the weekend, and then the other one during the week was a little bit lighter. And that's what that looked like. I'm a big advocate of having an alternate modality if you're a runner, just to avoid the impact stuff. And so a bike, a rower, I would, if I had all the space in the world, I'd get something like an arc trainer or an elliptical. I love that stuff. Just no impact. Even a Stairmaster is lower impact. I do the bike, but I almost would love another modality. I almost would love another one just to have on rotation for like when I want to get a good cardio stimulus without it necessarily needing to be running without impact. And so that's really big. I really enjoyed that. I have an Airdyne or an Echo bike, whatever, same thing, which is great. I'm very happy with it, but it's hell, obviously.
I feel like it's very hard for zone 2. I tried that for zone 2 initially, and it seemed like it was just very hard to keep it in there just because you are using your full body there with that.
Tell me what you found hard about it.
Just staying within it. If I used like, I guess what I found hard was like just staying within this, not letting the heart rate come up too high, basically there with that. But let me preface this by saying I started out doing my zone 2 on that. And so that was like my introduction to cardio and doing the zone 2. It definitely, one, I wasn't in as good of, I'm not in great cardio shape now, but definitely better than when I started. And I'm sure that was part of it. It was all new. And also I just didn't know, just to go back to what you said, figuring out what does zone 2 and that kind of, that intensity feel like. So I'm sure that was all part of it. I haven't used it since. I'm sure my results would be a lot different now at this point.
Well, you're not wrong. And what I find difficult about doing zone 2, I do a lot of zone 2 on that bike. So I'm familiar with the pros and cons. And it's hard because it's you driven, like you are the one who decides the pace. I do miss doing like the Stairmaster or the treadmill because it's passive. The thing's moving and I will accomplish my goal as long as I don't fall off. With the bike, there's a tiny bit of energy like a tiny bit of mental energy expended on keeping my pace. Like actively, I have to keep this pace. Yeah, you're not wrong. One of the best things that you can do when you are introducing a new modality is actually do a lot of high intensity work on it at the beginning. And so one of the things we did immediately was a ton of sprints on the bike. And what that can do is it can actually improve your coordination with this piece of equipment. And so you can more rapidly become efficient at a modality when you're working at higher intensity levels with it. And if I have someone who's, I don't bike a lot, or I don't use the Echo bike, or doing sprints on the Echo bike will help make you better at doing too. And yeah, after the race, or as we led up to the race, I was doing a little bit more running, a little bit less biking. And then after the race, I took a week of no bike or something like that. And so when we brought it back, when we started training up again, for this is my third week in a row of doing sprints, and I feel it. Like when I get on and I do zone 2, I did zone 2, and I was like, oh, this feels really challenging, really hard, really novel. And then after a couple of weeks of doing sprints, all of a sudden I get on there and it's almost like I feel much more in the flow with things. Now, the bike isn't a very technical thing. Let's be real. Like it's not very technique driven, not a lot of coordination. So that learning curve is short. But I do think if someone's like, hey, I got a recline bike or an air bike or an erg or something, I'm going to have them do some high intensity work on it to increase their proficiency at that task. And then it'll be more effective for other stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've heard that before. I don't know if I heard that from Alex or what that was, but yeah. As far as the cardio training goes, how long did these runs get? Because again, I think a lot of times maybe the misconception is, oh, hey, you're going to be going out and doing a ton of 13-mile runs and stuff like that. How long and how far did these cardio sessions get?
Yeah, so I think people understand with lifting that there's probably a per session volume SFR drop off at some point, right? So if we all understand the concept of, if I just keep doing sets within a workout, eventually I'm so fatigued that the benefit I'm getting from those sets goes down and down and down. Where that is exactly depends on the person and the exercises you're doing and all that stuff. But I think I'll just say once I hit that 1 hour mark, I know that the next 30 minutes, my effort drops off by, let's say, one chunk of effort. If I go from 90 minutes to 2 hours, big drop off in effort. I don't want to be there anymore. I'm tired. My nervous system is fatigued such that my output goes down. And so I think we all understand, even if it's like studying, if you're like, hey, I have to study and it probably takes me 6 hours of studying, I think we all agree that studying one time for 6 hours is less good than studying 6 times for 1 hour, for example. So this concept of a diminishing return within a single session, we all understand that concept. When it comes to running, that drop off tends to be somewhere in that 90-minute to 2 hour mark. Once you're in that 90-minute to 2 hour mark, we tend to see an unfavorable SFR shift where you can probably still go, right? You can still do let's say I go out at that 11-minute mile pace. Let's say I could run 3 hours at that pace. Let's say for the first 2 hours, my heart rate might be like sub 175, which represents a hard, but pretty concomitant effect, right? I'm working at a ratio that makes sense for what I'm doing. But that third hour, my heart rate might be at 185 the whole time, 188, which means I'm really fucking tired. I'm really fatigued for not as much, for the same amount of benefit. So the stimulus stayed the same, but the fatigue went up a lot. And so where we start to see some of the technical term is called aerobic decoupling, which just means the work that you're putting out and your heart rates start to decouple if you were to look at them visually, meaning heart rate's going up, but work or what you're doing is staying flat, let's say, or even going down, right? You can have decoupling where in that third hour, I actually slow down to keep my heart rate where it's at. And so my heart rate might still be at 175, which would keep that as more of a flat line visually, but I'm now running at a 13-mile pace. So that's decoupling as well. And so that SFR, and we also see that like certain bone adaptations peter out after 2 hours. And so your question was, how long are my runs? I don't generally recommend within like not sport practice, but let's say training for any of these races outside of maybe the psychology of being on your feet that long, doing runs longer than an hour and a half, 2 hours, especially if somebody has the opportunity to say, hey, let's stop at 90 minutes. Let's save some of that fatigue. Let's spend it on another workout. Just like that studying analogy of like, instead of doing 2 by 3 hours, stop at 2 hours and let's do another 2 hours on Friday and let's get 6 hours. And so the longest I ever ran was my hardest run before the taper, which was 2/3 of a half marathon's 13, 2/3. That's like 9 miles or so. And so that was my longest run, was about 9 miles. But I often ran anywhere from between 4 and 6. And the idea being that like there's just an SFR drop after a certain point. And if you can stop while you're still in a favorable SFR place and get another workout, then that would be a good idea. If someone's like, should I do a zone 2 for 60 minutes, or should I do that twice, or one zone 2 for 2 hours? It's, if you could do the 2 times 60, it'd be better. If you can't, then maybe a 1 time 2 hour. That's not a great example. I'm not sure I would ever really suggest 1 times 2 hour. That sounds absolutely miserable, but that's the point. The point is we all understand the concept of a per session volume amount that is practical or remains favorable from an SFR, stimulus to fatigue ratio perspective. For running, that's in that 90 minutes to 2 hours. And so that is usually the cutoff. And for me, that was in that 4 to 6 miles. Again, even 4 to 6 miles is well under that point, but that both met how fit I was at the time, right? We are talking about, that's even for elite athletes. And so I'm not even fit enough to be able to run that long. So it wasn't even super applicable to me. It's not like I was like, oh, I could really keep going after this 90-minute mark. I'm dying. So for me, I was more in that like an hour range, 4 to 6 miles. I definitely went up to 7, 8, 9 miles as it got closer to the race. And I started to see a little SFR drop off. I started to feel that I was getting really tired at the end of those workouts, but SFR is not the only thing, right? What about an appeal to psychology? What about me figuring out what the hell I'm going to think about and listen to and do for 2 hours out there on the road? What about just like specificity? Like I was legit nervous. What am I going to do for 2.5 hours? You know what I mean? And so having some exposure to like being on your feet out for that long has some applicability, even if you trade away some SFR, right? There's still a time and a place for that.
So if somebody was doing like a marathon, obviously with that, your 90 minutes is going to be a lot less than like, I feel like with 90 minutes to 2 hours, you can get pretty close to the half, but like a full would be same kind of concept apply there with that too.
Yeah. The interesting thing is that the training's it's almost identical. I don't want to be hyperbolic or exaggerate and say that they are exactly identical, but if you consider the fact that a half marathon is exactly half as long, you'd expect the training to be notably different, right? We're talking about double the distance. It's not really. The way that you utilize your threshold intervals might be a little bit different. You might use slightly longer ones. You probably maybe want to just have a slightly higher volume, even though the volume levels aren't that different. If you look at elite half marathon and marathon runners, at the end of the day, I don't want to be oversimplifying it, but this is what Alex would say if he was sitting here, is that good runners are good runners. And there's really only so much work you can do across the week. And if you look at pro marathon runners and professional half marathon runners, like their volume and workouts are incredibly similar. So even if you're running a marathon, I still wouldn't have any workouts longer than 90 minutes to 2 hours. I would just acknowledge that that I would just try and get another one of those workouts in. There might be a time in place for, like we said, for going past that point, for specificity, for time on your feet. Just personally, though, some of that psychology of time on your feet, something that Alex and I have talked about, is if you want some of those time on your feet adaptations, time spent moving, time with a slightly elevated heart, I'm talking about that specificity of this race is going to take this long. I need to be able to do work for this long, stay associated with what I'm doing for this long. I need to like have that much time on my feet. I really like long hikes for that, not crazy intense ones where we're all of a sudden introducing such a novel stimulus from like a durability perspective that you're going to be mega sore and that you're going to be like doing all this crazy downhill work with all this impact. But getting out there on a moderately difficult hike that's out maybe for 3-4 hours. If I was going to get somebody to practice being out there and putting in work and all that stuff, or like time on your feet, sort of psychological specificity, I'd love to do like long hikes for that. I think that's a great option that doesn't sacrifice as much from an SFR perspective.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. What did you guys monitor, and what would you recommend? Again, your just maybe Gen Pop, or even somebody who doesn't want to do like half marathon or something like that, like to monitor in terms of like how to know you're progressing.
How to know you're progressing. That's an interesting one. I think that you can pick you can go all in, and you can over time see heart rate stay the same at higher pace or go down at the same pace. You can also look at your zone 2, because zone 2 is very steady state, that it's a little bit easier to accumulate the kind of data that points in that direction very firmly. And so if you're doing your bike intervals, my bike intervals are 100, or not intervals, sorry, my bike zone 2, it's 160 watts for 45 minutes, whatever. But because it's steady state, I can get a pretty clear picture of whether or not that is my zone 2. And I can go for and try and shoot 10, 15 watts higher in a couple months from now. And I can probably get another pretty clear picture of how much more fit I'm getting. And that's only one metric, but it is a decent proxy for overall. It's like if my zone 2 is going up, like I'm getting more fit. we haven't been big on testing, because just like you would test your 1 rep max, like anytime you're doing a test, you're trading SFR away for that data, which you could do, but I think you can learn. What's interesting is client feedback is so important, because heart rate is pretty fickle. It's not so simple. So many things affect heart rate. And a lot of my clients will get on the back end and we can see their heart rate, I can see their cadence, I can see their pace, I can see their fucking body temperature, I can see, and they're like, oh, what are you looking for? And I'm like, I can see what I can see here, but I care so much about what you thought about this workout. And another concept that we've taken from lifting a little bit is this idea of RIR. Instead, it's IIR, it's intervals in reserve. And I really care about, when you finish this interval workout, how many more of these you think you could do. That's a real telling thing for me, because I rarely want it to be 0. I rarely want it to be all the way to failure. And that's really telling. If someone's like, I could do several more of these intervals, then that's probably a moment where we can try and progress somewhere. And so I really love that interval in reserve. So checking what your zone 2 speed is, or your zone 2 watts, is a really nice thing to see go up over time. And also this interval in reserve, there's no hard and fast rule. If it's 3 or more, you can go faster this day, but it is a little bit more vague, where it's, if you accomplish this workout and you didn't die, we could probably do a little bit more. It is that simple. If I have a client who's, and sometimes I can see that in the heart rate, but nothing matters more than their feedback. So that all of the time, like we might get on a call and I'm like, they're like, what do you see? And I'm like, first, tell me how it went, and then I'll let you know what I guessed based on what I see, because sometimes it doesn't match up.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you guys use anything like resting heart rate or anything like that?
You very much could. Not you totally. I think if I have a client that has it, we will use it. And when I say use it, I just very generally assess a trend, not in an acute sense. Oh, your resting heart rate is high today. Let's
train. No training. Yeah,
no training today. You can just lay down. Yeah, we won't do that, but we might use that as, if we see like multiple consecutive days above certain numbers, maybe we trade out what would have been your really hard workout for a zone 2 day or an off day or something like that. But usually it's client feedback is just so important. Even days with high resting heart rate, high or low HRV or anything like that, like you could still perform really well.
Yeah. Sometimes those things can become a crutch, and it's okay. You're still good to go, even though it says that. Don't lose sense of that feeling aspect of it, because that's super important. Cool, man. What about upcoming for you? Is there anything, like, what are kind of your upcoming goals? What are you working on now? What does training look like now?
Yeah, like you said, we got a baby coming in mid-April.
Congrats.
Thanks, man. I'm training for a 5K. Which sounds so funny, because like, it's like, for me, it's, oh, you run a half marathon. I'm like, what's the next step? Run a marathon, right?
Yeah.
And the irony is I'm in this for 2 things. I'm in this for the health benefits. I have asthma. And so this is not like a woe is me scenario, but like, I have asthma, and that's been like, man, I don't need to get any more muscular than I am right now, because there's no health benefit for me. I'm not saying I'm super jacked, but like I have enough muscle that like more muscle doesn't make me any healthier, but I'm really fighting an uphill battle with that, meaning like when I'm 60, 70, 80, 90, like that's going to be a big deal. And I really think that there's almost no limit to how cardiovascularly fit I'd like to get to fight against that. I don't know why I went that route. That was not the question, but training for 5K. That is 5K is interesting. So 5K, 3.3 miles. Well, we talked a lot about this threshold thing. 5.5, 3.3 miles, if that's in that like 20 to 40 minute range, it's north of threshold. And so what's funny is like a 5K in many ways is more painful, almost categorically more painful than a half marathon. You're going to be running your 5K from the whistle at a pace that sucks. It's going to be hard from the 3rd or 4th minute. It's just a pace that you can keep doing under a high amount of discomfort the whole time. Whereas like the first, I don't know, 2/3 to 3/4 of the half marathon, it's not that I was breezing, but like I wasn't fighting through a deep amount of pain, and it was just very gradual increase. But the 5K from the first kilometer is going to suck and be painful, and you're going to want to quit and slow down and stop, like because that's what threshold is. It's this rapid increase in lactate accumulation and other metabolic byproducts that are sending signals to your body that you're in pain, that you want to slow down, that you need to stop, and you have to keep going. And so that is very interesting to me. And I'm also very interested in what the difference in training looks like, because like we just said, it's not like the marathon and the half marathon are identical, but if you had if I told Alex, like, hey, what if I wanted to run a marathon? He's like, yeah, we just continue on the course that we were. Like, we barely make any changes. You just need to get better at running, right? We need to continue to get you to get better at running. And we've been working on distance. We're going to keep doing that. But a 5K is a distance. It's not a sprint, but it's certainly a distance where the programming changes enough that it interests me. I probably would go do a mile run after this or an 800 meter, because then it really changes. Then you're working on the track and you're doing like 200, 400 meter repeats, more sprint work, more speed work, let's say. And that's a really interesting thing, because honestly, half marathon and up becomes very similar, not exactly the same, but very similar. Anywhere from a 5K to half marathon is similar. Sub 5K, we're talking just a very interesting shift that I would like to expose myself to. But we got the baby coming, so I'm gonna do this 5K in end of March, and then I'm really just gonna turn everything to maintenance. I have no idea what dad life's gonna be like. My goal would be 2 lifts a week and 2 cardios a week. That's not going to be enough for me to maintain muscle. I suspect that I will lose some muscle. I've lost some muscle during this endurance experience, not because of adding the running, but because I really lowered the amount of volume I was doing. Like, I'm right now at under 100 minutes of training a week. Easy. 3 days a week, 33 minutes would be 99 minutes. And that's about where I'm at. And so I probably was at like 300 minutes a week at my peak, 4 times a week, 90 minutes potentially. That's 360, right? And that's probably where I was at my peak, like post college years. And I've gradually been decreasing, but this was the lowest. I was doing like 12 exercises a week total for 2 sets each. It was like 24 sets a week. People do 24 sets for one muscle group. And so I did lose some muscle, and where I lost muscle the most, guess what? It is exactly where I lowered volume the most. It was my arms. I was like, because part of that minimalist approach was acknowledging that I can get some bicep and tricep stimulus from like bilateral pressing and pulling. And that's true. And I'm sure that's why my arms didn't fucking shrivel up into raisins, but I basically didn't do any more bicep and tricep. I was like pressing, pulling, delts, legs, pressing, pulling, delts, legs. We're going to let biceps and triceps go. And what if you were to graph out my muscle loss? I lost some muscle, but then it stopped. Like, once I went down 3 days a week over the next 6 months, I lost some muscle, but it has certainly stopped. So I know that it's funny, is that volume represents a size for me. And if I just keep doing it, I won't lose any more muscle, but I certainly did lose some muscle, particularly in my arms. And my goal is to go to 3 days a week full body, but get my arm stimulus up, which is what I'm doing now. And frankly, even just like one mesocycle of doing it, I already noticed the difference visually, just bringing biceps and triceps back in. I know it's funny because Brian did his own N of 1 study where he trained one arm for 6 months and the other one not at all. I think the difference is that if he had detrained them for a year and then did this, I bet you the one he trained would have regrown much better. That's what I'm seeing. So I think that is just not necessarily the same thing. So what my point is that training my arms more grew my arms, duh. But someone else could say I trained my arms less and nothing mattered. You were probably doing a ton of other volume, whatever. There's certainly just not 100% applicable, but I've enjoyed that. I guess I thought I always cared more about pecs and back, visually, aesthetically, egotistically. I missed having like nice arms. And so that's going to be a little focus for me. Yeah.
Do you think it was like obviously the drop in volume there, but do you think it also was the drop in volume with the combination of the increase in volume from running and the endurance side of things as well too, that probably impacted that? Whereas, hey, if you would have cut the endurance training in half, do you think it would have been the same thing, or do you think that didn't have an impact there at all?
I don't think it had an impact because I barely lost any weight. And so I don't think it would have had an impact because I was mostly at maintenance calories. I lost some weight initially when I lowered volume and increased running. I lost 5 pounds, but then it totally leveled off.
Which makes sense. Yeah.
I don't think the running, I look at it as way more that you just stopped training them as much,
less volume,
and that would have happened regardless. And someone's counter argument could be like, okay, but like the running maybe had some impact, maybe, but I would put the vast majority of why I have smaller arms to I trained them less.
And I'm sure too, you were smart about, obviously like you said, nutrition. You weren't in a deficit. You were making sure you were feeling up there with that. I'm sure your recovery and everything was on point too, which is going to also play a massive role in that too, right? Where you take somebody who just starts training and then they're low protein, they're in a deficit, their sleep sucks. That's probably going to start to have an impact there at that point. Cool. So training now, you're back up to 3 days from a weight training perspective, you said?
Yeah, three days a week. And I just took metaphorically, I took a little bit away from back and chest, and I put in some really high I would say high volume, but mostly via a ton of intensity techniques for arms. So 5 to 7 sets per workout with 30 to 60-second rest. And I'm not just dying on this hill just yet, but I do think that's stimulus per time, because that's my only goal here is I don't want to spend any more time in the gym. That's just been, it's been monumental. I feel, and I start that sentence with I feel like, because I don't know, but I do feel like, man, that's just been when I have the opportunity to rest shorter without any downside and still get a reasonable amount of reps, more than one or two. I've found that's such a good way to get more volume in. And so it's just been really nice. And just doing like cross cable extensions, 5 to 7 sets, 60-second rest takes me like 9 minutes or whatever, when 2 or 3 sets would have taken me 9 minutes. And I just feel like this is a win in terms of total stimulus.
Absolutely. Are you doing like drop sets, myo rep sets, rest pause, all the above?
Yeah. What is myo reps if not just a really short rest period? Myo rep is
Basically,
just,
yeah.
If I write myo reps to somebody, it's like a set
Short period.
and then a bunch of short rest period sets.
Yeah,
and so
true,
all we've done is just taken that concept and expanded it a little bit. So the way I was explaining this to a client the other day is straight sets are really like your bread and butter. You're going to get 3 really good sets and they're all going to be hard sets, all that stuff. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the really low rest spectrum is myo reps where you're like barely resting. And you could say, if you want to get more stimulus per time, that's the best way to do it. But emotionally, they're right. They're right. You could, the shorter you rest, if you don't have to, you could probably rest as little as you need to get good stimulus out of the next subsequent set. Yeah, you trend more towards less rest. But actually, the rest is so low on myo reps that it's actually really emotionally challenging. Like myo reps like really fucking hurt. And it's almost like more daunting. I find like that 30 to 60 second to be enough for me to just take a couple really deep breaths, like change the song on the iPod or something. And then like iPod, Jesus. And then a couple deep breaths and then like gear back up and then get back into it. And I found that emotionally feels a little bit more, if it's like myo reps, you're like, you finish your last rep, you're like shaking it out. You're like couple, you're right back to it. And it's I'm not saying, and I'm not trying to be a little bitch about it. Myo reps are awesome. I love myo reps, but I find that like 60-second rest to be almost, I feel almost fully recovered. I'm not, because I can tell by the reps dropping off, but I feel almost fully recovered. It feels nice. It feels like a little bit just easier on the soul.
And that kind of lines up, I feel like, with the rest time research. Like you can get away with lower rest. It's just you probably have to do a little bit more volume overall. And it sounds like that's pretty much what you're doing there with that. And again, that can be a cool way to train. I do like that. I feel like the pump is, again, I know we're not just trying to go for the pump, but I feel like the pump's good. The stimulus is always good when you can do it that way. Real quick before I let you go, man. So you're talking about, hey, I might have to drop down to 2 days. You don't really know what that's going to look like, but let's say you do have to drop down to 2 days from a weight training perspective. What are going to be your like kind of bread and butter movements here, like during this period of time? And probably, I guess, take it from like a movement pattern standpoint, but then what you specifically will choose based on your experience and what you like from like a stimulus. Cause I'm assuming it's going to be a stimulus to time thing here with this, where you're just going to try to pick the highest stimulus possible.
Yep. Probably if it's in a perfect world, I have one day that has a RD on a leg extension and the other day has my little like leg press hack squat machine and a ham curl. And then 3 upper body moves, probably 1 push, 1 pull, 1 bicep. And the other day, 1 push, 1 pull, 1 tricep. Probably get rid of lateral delts entirely. Just hope that stimulus from pressing and stuff just gives me a decent stimulus. Really dial in kind of what we were just talking about. Like every opportunity I have to myo-ish rep these, or incomplete rest method, or 60-second rest, or whatever you want to call it. Probably lean into every stimulus to time ratio thing I can do. And I'm looking at that and I'm like, you're going to lose muscle. There's just no way you maintain leg muscle with fucking 4 exercises a week. And there's no way you maintain upper body muscle with 6 exercises a week. But it is what it is. What's the other option is to scrap cardio and train as much as I can, which is still potentially, listen, there are parents out there that are already laughing at me for saying I'm going to train 4 days a week. And I don't like, I'm keeping the door firmly open that I have no idea what this is going to be like. So just get off my back about it. I'm going to try my best, but I know I don't know. And so we'll see. But I'm really, Scott, not to go there, but I'm really not worried about it. I'm really not worried about losing muscle. I'm actually, for the first time ever, in a very crazy way, like I'd rather lose muscle than lose cardiovascular fitness. I know that that's crazy in our world, but I firmly believe that whatever muscle I'll lose in the next year of my life, if I go back to these 3 days full body, like I'll come back to where I am today, which is where I'd like to stay forever. And so it's easy to say now though. It's like, I bet you when I'm like shrinking and I like feel not muscular and parent life is taking a lot of that off my plate, You can check back with me then, but I'm trying to mentally prep myself.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's easy to say now, but then when you're actually there, yeah, you might change. But I think it makes sense from a cardiovascular standpoint. I feel like that will probably help you out during that period of time too, at least from my understanding of being in better cardio shape, how it can really impact like recovery and just how you feel from day to day. And you know that you're going to be under recovered during that period of time. And I'm assuming food wise, just maintenance and whatever you can get in during that period of time as well there with that.
Food wise,
Yeah.
oh, definitely maintenance. Just I don't know. Again, I have no idea, man. I
Yeah.
function
We'll
pretty
see.
well on low sleep, but I don't. It's been a while since I had a responsibility that really threw a wrench in things. Like I've been blessed to like have my own schedule and sleep what I want, and so we'll see.
I think the only thing I would change on that, and again, this is me saying this without having any kids, I would keep lateral delts in there as much as I could. At least try to get at least one lateral delt exercise in there.
Watch your biceps shrink. Watch your biceps and triceps shrink, and let's talk. I'm
Then-
telling you, my guys, and I was like not filling out sleeves, and it's again like from a cracking up egotistical way. I would just crack myself up. I was like, I thought Dr. Mike has a fucking hysterical YouTube short that I just came up on my thing the other day of like big arms, like it wins every argument or something like that. It was just like I was just dying laughing, and I saw it and I was like, yeah, he's right, man. Like delts are cool and pecs are cool,
That is
but
true.
like big arms still just wins every argument.
That is true. Again, same thing. Like if I'm actually in that situation, I'm sure I would think a lot different too, especially if the arms weren't fitting out the shirts as well or anything like that. So cool, man.
The thing that's been on my mind a little bit is this idea of I talk about it and haven't done a lot of it, but like this idea of if you're trying to add volume, if you're trying to add stimulus, all of the ways you can do that, right? You can add an extra day of training. You can add an exercise to the days you're training. You can add a set to the exercises you're already doing. You can intensity technique to get more stimulus per time. One of the ways I would be able to do that I am blessed to be able to do because my gym's in my garage is like, what if you just have a program 2 days a week and then like I go do lateral delts Saturday morning. I don't have a workout. Just go in and do 3 sets of lateral delts. Like it costs no emotion to do some behind the back lateral raises. It costs me like there's no like cardio component to that. So like these sort of like I'm gonna call it a workout snack, just like a workout snack. That's not necessarily what a workout snack is, but this idea of not like what do you have to do to make gains? You just got to do a lot of hard sets over the course of the week. Like we create workouts for practical reasons. The truth is like going into the gym for 60 minutes or like arbitrarily doing those movements throughout the day, it's the same thing. But you can't do that because the gym is 10-minute drive away. So you have to go there, do everything, and then go back to your life. But what if you were a personal trainer and you were like, you know what? In between every client, I'm going to do 3 sets. And over the course of the week, I'm going to do sufficient volume. That person's going to make equally good gains. And so that idea of what about I have Janice watching the baby for 15 minutes and I go and I do a set of hammer curls or two sets of what's stopping me from doing that? Sleep deprivation, probably not. Yeah, to work up to a heavy set of dumbbell press or something, or a heavy set of hack squats, I probably want to get in the zone, put that as part of the workout. But what's stopping me from just going outside, going to the garage before dinner and just like fucking shredding a couple of my rep sets of tricep extensions? That idea of, hey, I have a little time, like I can add some weekly volume, albeit kind of sporadically. There's really nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, no, that's a good thought experiment and definitely something that I'm sure you'll mess around with and almost have it like, hey, I'm not having a planned workout day. Just this is kind of my minimum for the week and where I can fit that in. I'm just going to get it in like when I can, basically at any point. I think obviously if that's all you can do, I think it would work. I'm like, I'm sure for some people mentally it would be challenging to like, you almost are probably going to feel like you're leaving something on the table, but you really aren't. So if you could get over that, I feel like it could be a great strategy there. So yeah, definitely. I'm sure that's something that you'll potentially implement. And then that's a pretty cool thought experiment there. Appreciate your time, man. I know you are headed to the hypertrophy camp, I believe, with Brian. So it'll be super cool to see what you guys come up with there. I finally did N1 and I'm going to do the practical at the end of March. So I'm going to be there a couple weeks after you, but really looking forward to going there. And yeah, those hypertrophy camps.
Come to the hypertrophy now. If you've not done the biomechanics one, you should do that, but that'd be dope if you can.
My goal would be do this. And then whenever you guys do the hypertrophy camp in the future, because I'm assuming you have to, I guess it's not a prereq to do biomechanics like before the hypertrophy camp, or is it probably?
I doubt there's a prereq, but if you did the course online, I think you'd be fine. But even as much as I'd want to hang out and if for you, I think doing the practical is a better use of your time.
Yeah, and then do the hypertrophy camps in the future because those look super cool because those are like just like the new things that they are implementing and stuff like that, yep. Correct? And new research and all that.
Yep.
Cool. All right, man. Again, appreciate your time. Anywhere we want to lead the audience to or anything coming out on your end that you want to tell the audience about?
Nope. Fire over to Instagram. That's where I do most of my stuff. Got a podcast as well. And Jordan Lips Fitness is where you'll find everything.
Cool, man. We'll have you on again here soon, and I'm sure we'll be talking about dad life and how your programming and everything's been going there with that. So talk to you soon, man. Again, appreciate your time.
Very appreciate you having me on.